Topeka K. Sam. So as I said, the bios are on the website, and so you can go to the website to read their full bios, because every single person who is speaking today is just brilliant and amazing. And yeah, so there's lots to say about everyone. We won't have time to read all of their bios. I'll just say that Topeka is the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministry and co-founder of Hope House NYC. And if she wasn't here right now, she would be on Sirius XM Radio hosting her show, the Topeka K. Sam Show, on channel 126, which is on Sundays at 9 a.m. So please help me in welcoming Topeka Sam to the stage.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to start by saying thank you, JCPA, UJA, JCRC, all of the funders for this wonderful conference. I know that it wouldn't have happened without you, and it is so necessary, and the time is now. Hi, Abby, I haven't seen you in a while. And then I would like to say from Piper, if you are on the Twitter, you can follow me at Topeka K. Sam. So my name, easy. And then you can find everything else that I do on that. But I am given the great opportunity to talk about the issues that face women in incarceration, specifically because of my own experience, but also because we aren't talked about enough. But before I start, like I always do, I want to acknowledge all the women in the room who have been incarcerated or who have had an incarcerated loved one. If you can please stand. Okay, I would like to give them a round of applause. It's incredibly difficult for us to live in our truth every single day, vulnerable, exposed, and reliving our trauma. And so each of the women that you've seen, they are doing incredible work in this space. We work together, and I think that it's incredibly important that you take time out at some point to connect with them and meet with them. Okay, so a little bit about me, because I hear that this is an audience that is new to this, right? So it's cool. Because I was too, so until my experience. So just about my background, I was born in New York. I'm born and raised in New York. My parents were from Harlem in the Bronx, and they wanted something different for us. So they built a house in Manorville, all the way at the south end of Long Island. Anyone from Brooklyn in here? Okay, so I'm looking at faces, not saying age, but my parents, my parents actually owned a Carvel franchise on Utica and Eastern Parkway for 20-something years, yes. So I was the cool kid in school because I bought everybody an ice cream cake for their birthday. Outside of that, I played every single sport, captain of every single team, president of every single club. I was president of the Spanish club and didn't speak Spanish, so that tells you a little bit about my personality. But in all of that, I was classically trained in piano and flute, took dance lessons, like given my brothers, played violin, cello, and percussion. We've had every single opportunity that any child would want, irrespective of race, right? And so we were the only black family in our neighborhood, and for obvious reasons, I decided I wanted to go to an HBCU, historically black college, because I wanted to be around other students that looked like me. And so I ended up choosing Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, just like most children, you leave your parents from a sheltered life, and then you end up going into another state. You don't have to practice piano for an hour a day. You can kind of do what you want to do without any authority telling you anything. And so what happened was I decided that it was another culture shock for me. So I go from being the only black person in a white community to now being with my brothers and sisters, though very, very happy. I was treated a little differently. You know, I laugh now and I say my swag was a little different. So I wasn't received the same as some of my friends. And so I was told, you know, you're pretty to be dark skinned. And though I knew I was a black woman, I didn't know that there was really a difference. I wasn't taught that, and I had no idea. I was told that I talked like I was white. And again, I didn't understand what that meant. I knew that I spoke how I spoke. And so I would call home and ask my parents, like, what does this mean? What's happening? And I found myself wanting to just be accepted and fit in. And so I decided to, veer off campus, party in the city. My parents had a place in Harlem as well as the house in Manaville, so I began to rep Harlem as where I was from, although I was only there on Saturdays because I wanted to be accepted, right? And so in that, I started dating guys who sold drugs, not really even understanding what they were doing or why. And then eventually I said, well, if they can do it, so can I. And so while going to school, selling drugs, starting businesses, this went on for years. And then finally, while I was division chairperson for Amtrak for New York and DC, I had a business and I wanted to start another business. I received a phone call and it ended up being a federal sting operation. And I found myself arrested in Virginia. And I'm there, and I think, all right, well, I just bail out. It's not a big deal. This was a drug conspiracy case, and there were no drugs. It was a sting operation. So basically, we didn't do anything. And come to find out, the judge said that I was a drug queen pin and a threat to society, and I could have no bail. So it didn't matter how much property we could put up, how much cash that we had on hand, or that anybody... hundreds of people were willing to sign a bond for me. I had no way of leaving prison. And so I'm in the county jail in Pamunkey. It's called Pamunkey Regional Jail in Richmond, Virginia. So you hear the name, so you can only imagine what it was like. And it was a lot of women who were there, and I decided I was in a cell for about 21 to 23 hours a day because the women who were federal detainees were separated from people who were in from the county, because the federal system had a contract with this particular prison, so we couldn't be in the same cell together. So the only way you were allowed to get out of your cell was when you took classes. And the only classes they offered there were like drug treatment, AANA, GED, my education was past that. And so I decided to go to the classes because I wanted to learn why people use drugs. I thought that people use drugs because they wanted to. And then I started hearing the stories of the women. And I always speak about this young white girl who told me that her father was raping her and gave her heroin and told her to take it and the pain would go away. And there was another young girl who said that the only time she was able to spend time with her mother was when they smoked crack together. And it was all of these stories of sexual trauma, violence, and abuse. And I quickly realized that they did not have a choice. Many of the people who were closest to them, who we think are to protect us, were the ones who were causing the most harm to them. And so prior to me going, and I remember I was raised in the church, so I knew who God was, and I opened my Bible, and the first scripture my eyes went to was Romans 8:28. And it said, in all things, God does good for those who love God, who are called according to their purpose. And so I could not understand, what good would come out of me sitting in prison. But I also understood that I was called to do something. Like there was no way and no reason why I would have to experience this. And so I decided, instead of trying to fight the case from inside, understanding what the system was, even though we had resources for an attorney, it didn't make sense. And I was guilty, and I wanted to take accountability, and so I pled guilty. And I ended up going to federal prison. And so when I got to federal prison, it was different in the sense of when I was in the county jail, was a lot of poor women of color or white women. And then in the federal system, we were incarcerated with lawyers, doctors, senators, bankers, women who had high levels of education, but yet still the tie-in was this trauma and the trauma that was unhealed. And I would know that, going on visits, because I was fortunate, I had visits nearly every single week. But the visiting rooms for women would be very empty. I would see women crying because they received divorce papers while they were in prison, or the fact that they lost custody of their children. The fact that we would have to pay for personal hygiene products. People think that there's this idea that you get everything for free while you're in prison, but that's not true. And so, my personal experience, which leads to some of the other work that we do, was I had uterine fibroids, so those who understand what that is, which means that your cycle is on sometimes a month at a time. And though I was able to buy pads because I had the resources, I had support from family and friends, that they told me I had to quantify my cycle in order to get more pads. So for those, and this is going to be a little graphic for those, I just want to have you understand the things that we have to go through, that I was told I had to take the used pads and put them in a brown paper bag and give them to an officer, who was typically a male officer, to look in the bag, to see that they were used, so they can issue me 5 more pads. And this went on and on and on. And just the humiliation, the way that felt for me. And I was a person that wrote things up, and, I was always speaking about, the injustices of incarceration while I was there with my lipstick on, Ivy nose. But it was devastating. And I couldn't imagine the things that women who had less resources, less courage and strength were going through. And so I was released in 2015. And at that time, I just hit the ground running because I knew what I had been called to do. I figured that out while I was there. And so I started organizing around the country with other formerly incarcerated women and finding that it was the same things that were happening. Women now on the other side, there's no housing opportunities. There's no educational opportunities. There's no job opportunities. There's all these barriers because of your criminal conviction. You're on probation or parole, and you have an officer who is overzealous, who is not necessarily giving you the things to help you move, but it's bringing you back, which is why we have 1.1 million women presently under surveillance or probation and parole right now. And so when I started my organization in October or June of 2017, the Ladies of Hope Ministries, it was with all of the women that I left behind in mind. The idea was to create resources and opportunity through access to high quality education, spiritual empowerment, entrepreneurship, advocacy, and housing. And Hope House, which we opened in October of 2017 in the Bronx, is a safe housing space for women and girls who have experienced incarceration. And we have girls who are 18. We have a woman who is 65. We have a sister who is transgender. We have women who have gotten their paralegal certificate and now practicing law with the law firm on helping women get their immigration rights back. We have just incredible women in our program. But in New York, some of the work that we're doing, I'm senior advisor at New Yorkers United for Justice with Khalil Cumberbatch. I don't know, I didn't see Khalil yet. But he's the chief strategist, and we are focusing specifically on efforts here in New York. And I'm just speaking about that because we're in New York. But with that, right now we're looking at clemency and parole reform in our next legislative session. And I was thinking about the clemency initiatives that have happened around the country. When we all know those through President Obama did CP14, which was a clemency initiative that helped to bring people home. And though it was a great initiative because the president has executive power to change or to help some of the draconian laws that have passed, because what happens is the system understands that these laws are, outdated and harmful, but they're not retroactive. And what retroactive means is if you've been in prison and sentenced to life for something in the 80s, that even if the law has changed today, that means you still have to remain in prison under that same law. And so there are some women who have been incarcerated for 40 years, even in New York. And when we think about, a just system versus an unjust system, and, innocence versus, someone who's guilty, at what point do we look at these sentences and say, enough is enough? How much time? Yeah, we can give that another hurrah. How much time is enough time to be rehabilitated, to be accountable, and to give your retribution, right? Like for me, I always say that prison did not change me. It was the women that I met that did. Did I have to go to prison to learn the things that I did? No. I could have easily went to NA and AA classes just like I did inside and hear those stories, because I became accountable and really understood the harm that I caused prior to me even being sentenced. So I think that, in spaces like this, that it's incredibly important that when we think about, women specifically, and I'm always going to talk about women unapologetically because we don't get talked about enough. Right. Like tweet that. But just, the fact that prisons and jails were not made for women and girls, period. I mean, I don't think they're made for anyone. The fact that, the humane societies will arrest a person if they keep a dog in a cage for too long. So why is it okay to keep people in cages for decades at a time? Thank you. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit because I can keep going. And I know I was told by Melanie, I think I had 10 minutes. So I'm sure I'm there. But I've been thinking lately about healthcare and access to healthcare, whether it's mental health treatment or medical treatment. A dear friend of mine, and I know Ivy, we were there when Mikkel Smith was there, passed away recently of breast cancer. And when we were inside, she was diagnosed. There was also a woman named Valerie Gaither in New York who was the longest living and sentenced woman in New York State Department of Corrections. Had done, I think, over 40 years, and she wasn't given treatment for her cancer diagnosis a month before she actually died. And the fact that, we know that the conditions are not, they're not right for anyone, whether your health is good or not. But the fact that, like, my sister had to die because she was not diagnosed properly and given the treatment that she needed while she was inside is something that has been really heavily on my spirit, and especially coming into the next month of October and Breast Cancer Month. I think it's really important when I think of calls to action, and I have several, but that's really, really heavy on my heart. I'm getting teary-eyed, excuse me. That there has to be ways that we are not only implementing legislation or the legislation that we have around compassionate release, and the fact that when people are sick and they've done a period of time, that they have an opportunity to come home and not either die in prison, die once they spend 40 years and then come home and die, or just die alone. And, for those in this room that have the opportunity to even offer services, even to the prison and jails, and say, like, hey, we have a clinic, or we have someone, or I know a doctor who, practices this, and they can help in oncology and do things for women. Like, we really have to stand and really help support our people who are so misforgotten and left behind. So I'm trying to dry my tears because I was up at 5:30 with my makeup done, and I don't want to get it messed up. But thank you all. I just got the cut off. I'm going to cut it off. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.